Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Andrew Pearce, the journalist, the conservative journalist who writes for the Daily Mail, wrote an incredible article a couple of weeks back in that paper about what he described as the fascist agenda of those pursuing the rights of and pursuing the legislation of rights for transgender men and women. He wrote about the RAF planning to ban women from wearing skirts, not because of feminism, but because of pressure from the transgender lobby. He talked about the girl guides taking boys who identify as girls into the guides, primary schools having gender-neutral toilets for pupils to tackle transphobia, unisex toilets to be introduced in Glasgow. A lot of these stories have come up in the last few weeks and months, and Pearce writes, and I quote, he writes, "How did the trans lobby become so influential? The answer," he writes, "lies in the fact that in the past 20 years, gay people have become more mainstream, with civil partnerships and gay weddings widely accepted. Not everybody, though, was content to let gays like me, who came out in the 80s and fought for equality, enjoy our newfound freedoms." He went on to say, "The extremists among us became bored by what had effectively become conventional mainstream lifestyles. Rebels without a cause, they had to find a new one, and they did gender politics." Now, I'm joined tonight by an old friend of mine, somebody I hold in very, very high regard. I don't like to call him a LGBT rights campaigner because he's been fighting for human rights across the board, for 50 years. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our programme our friend Peter Tatchell. Peter, welcome back. How are you?
Good, thank you. It's lovely to join you.
Peter, thanks for doing it. So, Andrew Pearce says this is fascism, and the transgender lobby have come out of the fact that gay people have become more acceptable in mainstream society, civil partnerships, gay weddings widely accepted. These people are not content. They want to push and push and push and push. What do you say?
Well, I think to describe it as fascism is frankly absurd. It's an insult to the real victims of fascism, the many people who perished under Nazism, and the very many British people who sacrificed their lives during the last war so that we could be free from Nazi rule. To equate the transgender agenda with fascism is really, really offensive. But on a separate issue, of course, Andrew has a right to hold his point of view. And I understand where he's coming from, but I disagree. I mean, I think, it's true that we've made great gains for lesbian, gay and bisexual people. That's fantastic. But why shouldn't we also make gains for transgender people? They too are a minority, like Jewish people or gay people, but minorities should have equal rights in a democratic, compassionate society. So I don't really understand what the problem is. I mean, no one is being harmed by trans people having recognition and rights.
The problem he has and I have is that we're talking about a very, and I'm not going to say insignificant, nobody is insignificant here, but we're talking about a very significant minority. And what we've seen, Peter, and I'd love to get your thoughts on where this has come from in the last year, the last couple of years, are things like new books being launched in schools, in primary schools for kids as young as 7. Books entitled "Can I Tell You About Gender Diversity?" Children being asked to consider what their sexual orientation is and what gender they identify with. As young as 6, 7, 8 primary school children we're talking about here. The British Medical Association saying let's not, say expectant mothers, because that might offend transgender people. And worse again, this pronoun nonsense that we're seeing in universities around the country. Don't say he and she, says thee. That's the definition of fascism, surely.
No, I disagree.
It must be, Peter.
I mean, you may not agree with it, which is your right.
It's an outrage.
I don't think it's fascism. Nobody is being compelled to use these gender-neutral pronouns.
But they are.
It's a suggestion. It's a recommendation. No one is being punished or disciplined or faced any kind of harm as a result of using a non-gender neutral pronoun. It's all about trying to be inclusive. We are, in our society today, much more inclusive of racial minorities and sexual minorities, and that's a good thing. But of course, those same minorities had to go through a big, long struggle to get recognition and rights. And when you think about the scale of violence and hate against transgender people, the level of prejudice against transgender people has led to astronomical levels of suicide and attempted suicide. Somewhere between between 3 and 5 in 10 transgender people have attempted suicide at some point because of family rejection or because of bullying at school and elsewhere. So I think it's absolutely right that we try and challenge that, and we try and create a space where those kids can feel safe and secure and affirmed.
I can't speak to the sort of hostility that you've described there, because I've not experienced that. And, one of the things we pride ourselves on here is we don't tell lies on this program. I don't know a transgender man or woman. Sadly, I don't. I'm not. Where I live, I've never met a transgender man or woman. I've interviewed transgender men and women over the years. I don't know any personally. But we're talking about less than 1% of the country's population, Peter. And what we're still not getting to the heart of is why, particularly in the last 2 years, the rollout of these strategies, talking to children about gender identity and about about identifying and choosing from a list of gender identities at primary school level. That's incredibly sinister, that. And not to mention, one of the things we get, emailed about all the time is this issue about the toilets. People say, when I talk about this issue on social media, when I express an opinion that I'm incredibly uncomfortable as a woman about a transgender man or a transgender woman, a man with, somebody who identifies as a woman but with male anatomy entering my toilet. And I don't want that to happen. I don't like the idea of that. I'm labelled transphobic and I'm abused on social media. You see, what I want to get to, Peter, is where is this coming from? Because for me, there are always idiots in society who will abuse people, Peter. Jesus, how many times have you and I spoken over the years about the crap that you had to put up with in the 70s, in the 60s, 70s and 80s? The nonsense. And my admiration for you and people I know like you is undying in the nonsense you had to put up with. But we've got laws, don't we, against abusing people and calling people names and putting people into a situation where they feel vulnerable or threatened. And those laws are pretty clear. And those laws are for everybody. What I don't understand is, where is this coming from? This has come out of nowhere, this. And for me, it's a non-issue.
First of all, let me say, it's not about numbers. It doesn't matter whether the number of trans people in society is 10%, 1%, or 0.0011%. There are only 1% of Jews in Britain, yet every Jewish person deserves respect, acceptance and equal rights. We don't play a democracy based on numbers. We stick to the principle of universal human rights. As I mentioned to you, because of family rejection, bullying at school and hate crime on the streets, a very high proportion, between 30 and 50% of trans people have been victims of actual violence, and about a similar figure have also attempted suicide because of these pressures. That is a shocking statistic. And I can remember over the last few years a number of cases where trans people have been murdered in horrific attacks, not just strangled, but strangled and stabbed 20, 30 or 40 times in a frenzied attack because the killer has had a real visceral hatred of trans people. Now, we do have to challenge that. And we can have a disagreement about the way we challenge it, but I think we all owe empathy towards the suffering, marginalization, exclusion that trans people have traditionally had. You've got to remember that until the last few years, it was lawful for an employer to sack a staff member because they were transgender. It was lawful for an employer to refuse to hire them. It was lawful for a landlord to evict a trans tenant from their property or to refuse to give them a tenancy. It was lawful to refuse to serve a trans person in a shop, a restaurant, or a pub. These protections have only come in the last few years, and thank heavens they have, because you go and speak to many trans people, and they will tell you horror stories of the victimization, abuse, threats, and physical violence that they've suffered. None of us would want that on any person we love. And
No.
there are people out there who are trans, who are loved and are appreciated. They shouldn't have to suffer it.
Listen, you know you're not going to get an argument from me on that. Violence against anybody, threatening anybody is absolutely disgraceful. But we have laws against that. And if you want to talk about how we can educate our children, and I believe, of course, that should happen in the home anyway, educate our children to basically live and let live, that you educate children, your children, that everybody they come into contact with has a right to live their life as they choose, so long as it isn't hurting anybody else or breaking the law. But
Totally agree. Yeah.
Right. But Peter, to be asking children to accept somebody from the same sex, whatever they might identify with, to accept that person using the same toilet facilities as you, to ask them to be chosen from a list of genders, gender fluid, androsexual, demisexual, all of this, and then to be saying to them, I heard Nicky Campbell on Radio 5 Live interviewing a transgender man. In fact, transgender probably, I think the guy said that he was gender neutral, I think. And he said that it's offensive if somebody refers to him as he or she. They must refer to him as they. You see, I find this nonsense, Peter. I do. I find it absolute nonsense, right?
There's two issues here.
Yeah.
There's what we should do as polite, compassionate human beings towards others who are different, and compulsion. I don't believe that people should be compelled, but I do think that it's good to be sensitive to other people's feelings. And if someone doesn't want to be referred to as he or she, then I think it's a reasonable accommodation to say, let's try and accept what they would like to be called. I don't think anybody should be disciplined or punished if they use the word he or she, but let's try and be respectful. It's a bit like in the old days, black people didn't like being called Negroes. They wanted to be called black. Or gay people didn't like to be called queer. They liked to be called gay. It's all about respect. Now, when it comes to the issue of toilets, the toilet issue, in most cases where they have gender-neutral toilets, they are single cubicles. So a person goes into that cubicle, no one else is in there. It's just that the toilet door has both a male and a female symbol on it. I've been to schools and to universities in the last 3 weeks where they have that system. There's privacy, no one is offended, no one is harmed, no one is embarrassed. And that's the way to do it. I think there is another issue about the books in schools. These books aren't to propagandize about transgender issues. They're simply to encourage understanding and to break down prejudice. They're telling a story about people who don't fit into the categories of male and female, which some young children will not. And those kids need identification, affirmation, celebration of who they are. They don't want to be excluded, or I hope we don't want to exclude them by forcing everybody to be strictly male and female in their identification.
No, not
of course,
forcing them.
Again, it's no one's forcing the kids
No, of
to
course,
do this.
yeah. But why should they be asked to choose between 56 or 60 gender identities?
Well, I've
that is
never heard of
madness,
any
Peter.
school asking any child to do that. I've never heard of that. I don't think that's true.
Peter, it is. It's happening here. It's happening in the United States. And this is what I'm interested in.
No, I think it's
nothing
happening
happens all of a sudden, right?
I think it's happening at some universities and some organisations.
I can tell you it's
I've
happening in
never
primary
heard of it
schools.
happening in a school.
It's happening in primary schools. We know, because we reported in this programme, that a book called Can I Tell You About Gender Identity, about gender diversity, has been scheduled to be read by children in primary schools in this country. And to me, Peter, This is madness. It's madness.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else, and then I'll shut up and let you back in. I'm delighted you're on the programme talking about this. 24 and a half minutes to the top of the hour. The great human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell is back on the programme after a break. It's good to have him back after a long time since he was last on. We're talking about an article in the Daily Mail by Andrew Pearce, who is a conservative commentator and writer. He's a gay man. He wrote a very strong article about what he sees as what he sees as transgender fascism, in giving a series of examples, as we've already discussed. The British Medical Association saying drop the expectant mother. I mean, Peter, on that one alone, that is just insane, that, isn't it? I mean, that is insane. Why would you not say expectant mother? Why would you not do that? I know you're not saying this. I'm just asking you, as the devil's advocate, why would you bloody well recommend that people drop the word mother?
Well, I agree. I think in that case, it probably is a step too far.
It's
and
madness.
It does alienate people unnecessarily. But again, look at the intention. The intention is to be kind, to be sympathetic, to be understanding of people who are different, on the basis that there may be some trans people who are able to have a pregnancy, and they may not identify as female, they may not identify as mothers. So it's trying to be sensitive. I think, in my view, in most instances, it will be obvious, not always, but mostly it will be obvious if the person is male or female. In those cases, it's perfectly fine to call them expectant mothers. That's perfectly fine. But let's be sensitive to the small minority who may be trans and therefore would not prefer that label. But I'm not going to go to the wall over it. It's not the biggest issue to fight by a long shot. There are many other important trans issues to fight about, human dignity, acceptance and respect.
Let me ask you this, Peter. Let me ask you this.
I want to go back to the school book issue. The kids are not being pressured to make a choice. This book is to explain to kids in a very simple, easy to understand way about gender diversity. That some people are women and some people are men, but there are some people who don't identify as either. There are trans people. And it's just simply telling young kids that is a fact of life. And there are all these different kinds of categories. Acknowledge what you are. If you fit into the category of boy or girl, that's great. You're fantastic. But if you don't, you're also fantastic. You're also great. Don't feel left out. Don't feel excluded. Don't feel rejected or hated or marginalized. Whatever you are, it's fine. Providing, as you say, you don't harm anyone else.
I just want to remind you of this. I am mindful of time as well. Thanks for staying with me. Brighton and Hove City Council last year sent a letter to, I think, nearly 1,000 families, telling them which school their child would attend in September, and then asked them to respond with which gender their child preferred. This is primary school. And I tell you something, this is madness, but I'll tell you something else. I'd love to believe that you're right, that this is born out of compassion and inclusiveness. But I don't think it is, Peter. I think it's about something more sinister than that. I think it's an Orwellian type PC agenda where we're told this is the accepted opinion to have on any issue. And if you don't have that, you're liable to be called transphobic, bigoted, hateful, and all that sort of nonsense. I mean, we see this with safe spaces in universities. I saw a guy on Sky News last week who said he wasn't allowed to dress in drag for some university do because that might be harmful to a transgender man or woman. I think it's vastly more sinister than that. I don't think it's coming from transgender men and women, although I'll be the first to admit that what I said earlier is true. I don't know any transgender men and women, but I meet a lot of people, Peter, and we take people as we find them. We judge people on whether they're nice or not, whether they can hold a conversation or not. We don't care what they are, what they look like, what their sexual orientation is. And I'm guessing pretty much probably most transgender people are like that. This is not coming from transgender people. This is coming from something more sinister that's to do with shutting down freedom of speech. Where are you on this?
Well, I just want to pick you up on the thing about young kids. I would really recommend you and your viewers to watch a French film called My Life in Pink. I think it's a true story, or it's a dramatization of a true story, about a young boy in a very conservative family who doesn't feel comfortable with being a boy, and he struggled to find acceptance as a girl, and his parents in a conflict about that. The reaction of other family relatives, of people at school, of neighbors. It is the most beautiful film. It is such a wonderful, wonderful film, and it tells in a dramatic way the experience of many young trans kids aged 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, who realize they're different, who don't feel comfortable in the male and female roles or gender they've been assigned. And, you know, if you can try and get your head into that experience, this is not a universal experience, of course not. But there is a minority of young kids who fit exactly the story of that young boy who wanted to be a girl in My Life in Pink. And I challenge anyone to watch that film and not be moved. It is really one of the best films of all time. The human anxiety, depression, and ultimately triumph, because in the end the boy becomes the girl, the family accept him, the neighbors accept him, the school accept him. It's just a wonderful story of redemption. And that's what the books in schools are trying to address, so that other young kids in Britain today who are transgender don't go through the turmoil and angst that young boy had to go through, and certainly not the rejection by parents and teachers. So that to me is it's an amazing film. It is so touching. Now, back to your other point. I mean, this is coming from trans people. You know, this agenda to try and acknowledge and respect and accept trans people is coming from trans people themselves, out of the pain and suffering that so many of them have endured, often for decades. I mean, I know trans people who were sacked from their jobs because they were trans.
Well, that's outrageous.
Who were refused jobs because they were trans. I know of trans people who said at school they were bullied because no teacher stood up for them, that no other kids protected them.
Educate the teachers then, Peter. Educate the teachers then.
Of course, but we need to educate the pupils as well, because it's great having sympathetic teachers, but if your schoolmates are bullies and going to go for you because you're transgender, they can make your life hell.
Peter,
They can make your life unbearable. You can be driven to depression, anxiety, and even suicide.
And nobody should put up with it.
We've got to stop it. Maybe you think the way it's being done isn't quite the right way, but I think, you know, from what I've heard from the schools that I've been to, it is the right way. It is working. That in schools that have this education for pupils, you know, trans kids are much more accepted. They are much more self-affirmed. They feel better about themselves, so they're less likely to truant. They perform better at school because they're not depressed, so therefore they don't fail their exams. They're not bullied. You know, all round, it's a win-win, and I can't understand why anybody wouldn't want that for a child. You know, if it was your child, you wouldn't want your kid to be bullied. You wouldn't want your kid to feel depressed or suicidal. You'd want them to be happy.
Yes, I agree. Let me come back.
You want your kid to be happy.
Listen, how could I argue with that? That's the voice of reason. But asking children to, primary school children, in my opinion, they should not be asked to consider these issues in terms of being asked to consider their own gender identity and what they identify with. They shouldn't. I mean, there are some people tweeting the programme tonight. One claims to be a doctor but asks that we keep anonymity, you know, in mind, not to mention her. She says she thinks that this is an agenda to render gender actually meaningless itself in society. Now, there are other people tweeting that as well. I want to ask you this, Peter, before we run out of time. You talk about freedom of speech, and I believe you. I've known you for 10 or 12 years. I've been interviewing you on TV and radio, and I love getting your insights. There are men and women in medicine. Now, before you jump at me, I know some of them have religious affiliations. I'm not stupid. Some of them are with Christian Concern and other groups like that. But there are very well-known psychotherapists and psychologists who don't have any religious affiliations. I interviewed one such guy on this programme some months ago. His name is Joseph Berger. He's based in Canada. He's a famous psychiatrist. Now, Joseph believes two things. One, teaching, asking children at a young age to consider gender identity definitely harms their development, number one. And number two, He believes that there is no compelling biological, physiological evidence that some people have the misfortune to be born in the wrong body. He reckons that this is a psychological thing. However, as a man of science, he was honest enough to admit that he can't prove his thesis either. The jury is out on it. But he did say tellingly that when you mention this, when you try to have an adult debate about why some children, born as a boy or as a girl, identify with the opposite gender, when you want to have a debate about that maybe being an emotional problem, you get called bigoted, you get called transphobic, and the debate or the academic way of approaching it just goes out the bloody window. What do you think?
Well, of course, in a free and democratic society, we ought to be able to have a debate, and all sides of opinion should be heard. They should be challenged. They should be asked to produce the evidence and let people decide. I totally agree with that. I don't think people should be shouted down or banned or censored. But at the end of the day, as you've said, that psychiatrist or psychologist, he hasn't got any evidence to actually back up his claim.
Both ways.
What I know is that from my personal experience of trans people I know, that where they get support in school, or where in the past they've had support in the school, their lives are better and happier. And that's surely what we want for everyone. We want people of whatever gender identity to feel happy, to feel safe, to not feel threatened or menaced or ostracized. We want them to be part of the community, whether it be the school, the family, or indeed the neighborhood. Plus, of course, the workplace and elsewhere. That's what this is. To me, that's what it's all about.
Can I ask you a final question?
It's about loving other people and recognizing that some people are different from me, but I still love them and respect their right. If they're not harming anybody else, I want to have affirmation of who they are. And we do know from the experiences of thousands and thousands of trans people, where they do have affirmation in school, in the workplace, in the community, they are much, much happier. They're less likely to be bullied or victims of hate crime. They're much less likely to have mental health issues and much less likely to attempt suicide. So that surely makes the case.
I'm not sure it does. I know you mean what you say because I've known you a long time, and I'm not patronising you. It might sound like I am. I'm not. I hold you in the highest regard, Peter. I really do. 50 years of standing up for people's rights in all walks of life, in all in all areas, in all jobs. You've campaigned for workers' rights, for the downtrodden, for the poor. You're a tireless campaigner for religious people. I know.
People, even though I may disagree with their religion, I'll defend their right to not be discriminated, to not be victimised.
Even though sometimes heinous things are said about gay men and women, I understand that. Listen, finally, just to say, a lot of people are saying they still can't get over the primary school aspect. They are saying on Twitter, loud and clear, maybe in secondary school, maybe it's the time to talk about this, not primary school. Let me ask you a final question, Peter. What about the rights of people who don't want a situation where somebody gets to use the restroom that of the sex they identify with, even if they weren't born as that sex? People are asking that. What about their rights? Why are we always worried about the rights of, less than 1% of the population? And in this issue, we're not talking about the right of somebody to work, because I agree with you. He or she who sacked somebody because they are transgender should be hammered for that. It should never be allowed. Nobody should be made to feel like that. But in something as personal as using bathrooms, finally, last question to you, and I'll give you the final word. What about the rights of those people who say, no, I'm a woman, I don't want a man coming into my restroom, whether he identifies with a woman or not, I'm not having it. What about that?
Well, I hear those concerns. I understand why many people think that way or feel that way. But I think the simple solution is to have gender-neutral toilets where there's a single cubicle. So, for example, last week I was at a university. They had gender-neutral toilets. It was a row of toilets on the corridor. They all had both male and female symbols on them. You opened the door. There was just one cubicle. You went in. That's not interfering with anyone else. It's not threatening anybody else. it's a safe environment for everyone. That to me is the solution on that score. Going back to the issue about the kids in primary school, again, all I ask is people to try and look at it from the perspective of a confused, perhaps frightened, young transgender child who, feels that they are not what they've been told they are, that they're, their parents, everybody calls them a boy, but they feel a girl, or vice versa. In that situation, surely we don't want them to have the mental anguish. Surely we don't want them to have the anxiety, the confusion, the fear that goes with that uncertainty. So why not give them and other kids the message that their feelings are okay? They may not be feelings for life. They may, change later on. But at this moment, if that's what they feel, let's give them respect. Let's affirm them so they don't have those bad, negative feelings, and so others around them won't bully them. It's not asking a lot. We're not asking people to say, you have to sign up to be a transgender activist or to promote transgender rights. All we're saying is, don't put that young kid in a vulnerable position where he or she feels afraid, uncertain, confused, unloved, uncared for, and even, in some cases, threatened, menaced, and bullied.
I meant what I said. You had the last word on that. Just before you do go, though, Peter's website is petertatchellfoundation.org. You're in Manchester real soon, Peter. What's going on? I
am indeed. I'm speaking at Another Way Associates, their big event on the 16th of March. That event is going to take place, I think it's the Millennium Centre in Manchester. And we're going to be talking on that issue, on that day, about the whole issue of taking risks for human rights. So I'm going to be talking about some of the campaigns I've done over the years to try and challenge tyrants and dictators, and some of the risks I've taken in doing that. I'll just correct you. It's actually at the International Anthony Burgess Foundation at the Engine House in Chorlton Mill in Cambridge Street, Manchester M1, on the 16th of March at 7 p.m. So it's open to the public. Anybody wants to come along, please go to the website, and you can get, I think the tickets are free. You can go and get a ticket there and come along. And if you don't agree with me, you're welcome to come and challenge me. I believe in protest, and that includes the right people to protest against me. So if you want to raise these issues about trans questions or any other issue, come along on this Thursday, the 16th of March, at the International Anthony Burgess Foundation Centre. Great stuff, Peter. Thanks again. Great to chat with you. Look after yourself. Thank you, Archie. Bye for now. That's Peter Tatchell there on the line to us from his home in London. The website is petertatchellfoundation.org.